Today, it's my pleasure to talk with Professor Mike Merzenich. He's a professor emeritus at the University of California, San Francisco. He's also has ventures outside of his academic and research at the university, and that includes most recently as chief scientific officer and on the board of directors of Posit Science. And later in this podcast, I'd like to have Mike talk about his efforts to help people improve their brain function by, we think, changing its structure in good ways, its cellular architecture, if you will. Mike's got so many awards, it's too numerous to mention. But one important one, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the highest honors in many ways in science. Mike, why don't you start by talking about growing up and what got you interested in science? You grew up in Oregon, I guess?
Right. I grew up in a small town in the middle of nowhere in Oregon, you could say. And I was a hick, from the sticks, we would say. When I went to the university, I went to the nearest Catholic university because I was raised in a Roman Catholic family. And I was interested in, seriously interested in issues of, what's it all about? What's life all about? And issues of philosophy. As an undergraduate student, I actually pursued a general science major, thinking I'd be a medical doctor, thinking that was a natural destination for me. But I became very interested in issues of philosophy. And I actually sort of rebelled against my university because I thought their perspective was too narrow. And ultimately, I decided that philosophy was something you should study in the brain. And with absolutely no idea about what that meant, I went to the medical school in Portland, Oregon, which is where I was living. And I went to the physiology department, sort of by accident. And I asked the distinguished person that happened to be the chairman of the physiology department, John Brookhart, because I was directed to somebody interesting there that I could talk to. And I said, how can I study this as a graduate student? And he said, well, you can, or there are two people that I know of that I would highly recommend you work with. I might say the reason that he was nice to me was that I had actually conducted an electrophysiological experiment as an undergraduate. And he was really amazed that I'd accomplished this. I accomplished it with another student. And because he was impressed with me, he sort of was trying to recruit me. Turns out this was John Brookhart, who was president of the American Physiological Society. He was editor-in-chief of the Journal of Neurophysiology. I had no idea about it, no concept. That's right. He told me I had to go work with either Vernon Montcastle or David Hubel. David Hubel went on to win a Nobel Prize. Vernon Montcastle should have won one, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, well, what do I need to do to apply? He said, oh, well, have you taken the graduate direction? I said, yes, I just took it. He said, well, just send them a letter. To make a long story short, both of them accepted me before they got my graduate record exam scores because he told them to accept me. So that was back in an era of gross unfairness. I chose Montcastle because the stipend for a graduate student was higher. I had no concept really of how that they would relate to what I was interested in. I was interested in what's the neurological basis of us? How do we count for the remarkable creatures that we are? If people asked me what I was studying at that period, I would say I'm an applied philosopher. That was my answer, stock answer. But of course, what did that mean in the context of neuroscience in that era? When I went to the University of California after my postdoc, first of all, I did a really wonderful, had a really wonderful doctoral thesis experience with Vernon Montcastle. He was a tremendous person, a tremendous mentor. And he guided me. And he said, well, what do you want to pursue? I said, I want to pursue something that's more human, something that relates more directly to our human performance abilities. I want to ultimately study the neuroscience of cognition. And I had read a lot of the literature, and I'd made a superficial decision that an entry would be to study the auditory or listening brain. I was really interested in language in the brain.
Yeah.
And how we could relate to that or account for that. But I was interested in a more fundamental sense. How could we understand the way the brain is organized to process language? So he again, another old boys network thing. He said, well, then you have to work with Jersey. I was Jersey, I didn't know what Jersey was. Exactly.
It's a state this northeast of us.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, it turns out that Jersey, because you don't see the names like that written on scientific papers, he was talking about Jersey Rose. Rose, I knew. Rose was a great, auditory scientist. Beautiful studies on coding of sound from the inner ear to the brain, and also a wonderful central nervous system anatomist. So I knew who Jersey Rose was, but I didn't know who the Jersey was. I drew a blank on that. But he calls him, Bert calls him. And he says, and I quote, I'm sitting across in his office. He said, Jersey, I have a boy for you. I was never actually asked whether I wanted to go there, whether it was appropriate. But, you take the advice of a mentor you respect.
And that's Wisconsin.
It was at Wisconsin, and it was a wonderful experience. He turned out to be a wonderful mentor, a wonderful man, a wonderful example as a scientist, a person to work with. And so I had a great training experience there, basically making the transformation to be an auditory or scientist that's focused on audition and listening. And
you were doing research in non-human primates, right?
I was doing research in non-human primates, exactly, and which was a powerful model for the kind of thing I wanted to do, because I really wanted to make the transition to humans and studies in humans. That was my certainly my long-term goal. I dreamed, Mark, that I would someday write a series of equations on the board, and it would explain everything. You had this sort of juvenile conception of that consciousness and our understanding of the origin of ourself would just spring right off the blackboard and say,
there's thousands of people still studying that in some way or another, and it's a tough nut to crack.
I'm going to tell one more story before I get to science, and the story is that I accepted a job in neuroscience that came with an appointment to the Department of Otolaryngology, ear, nose, and throat doctors, because they represented listening medicine. And actually, I sought a medical connection. At neurology, it was what I was thinking of initially, but otolaryngology was great because they had people in that practice that thought about listening and thought about issues that related to listening and language, and it also associated in some ways with speech and speech communication. To make a long story short, there was a doctor there. He was actually on the external faculty, came and practiced there. His name was Robin Michelson, and he had done a very adventuresome thing, sort of wild and crazy, with a complete misconception of how the inner ear worked. Didn't really have a clear understanding of that. And what he'd done is he'd put a single electrode, a very crude device, and deliver an analog electrical stimulation to the inner ear of a deaf individual. So he just taking, you could say, the acoustic waveform delivered in electrical terms, and he was in a sense injecting it as electrical stimulus form into the inner ear, and he made all sorts of claims about what it did and about how this helped people. And there were two things about it that I knew were crazy. I knew about the communication industry and how it had defined the minimum amount of information you needed to deliver from the ear to the brain to represent speech as understandable or intelligible. So I knew that what he was doing could never represent speech as intelligible. And the second thing that he argued is that form of stimulation would be like reintroducing what's called a cochlear microphonic, which is the sum of the receptor potential. And that's what he was doing, just introducing that back, and the brain would know. I said, So because he was so flaky in his understanding and explanations, dismissed him and dismissed him and dismissed him, but he kept pestering me. He was a nice man. I became quite a good friend of his. And but he was sort of an annoying pest that really had little understanding of fundamental science that related to this. So at some point, in order to get him off my neck, I said, "Robin, bring me your best patient, and I'll look in detail of what she can." It turns out a woman, about a 50-year-old woman who had been deaf for maybe 10 years, totally deaf, and also I'll define what she can really hear, what she can really do with this device. So I had a friend who was a music professor at San Francisco State, and I had to make a bunch of music tapes and musical things. I set up psychophysical experiments so that I could look at the hearing of this person in detail and make an analysis of what they heard and didn't hear. And when this woman came into my laboratory, I was blown away. I could not believe what she could hear with this stupid device. Because what she heard was through the modulation of low frequency sound. She heard all of the sounds that you needed to distinguish the low frequency components of vowel sounds. And this is a critical component of what communication scientists called a baseband vocoder, a voice coding machine that they developed for the communication industry. Oh. And they created these devices with one of these baseband channels, which she had. And then with 5 higher frequency band limited channels, they could represent speech as intelligible. So, occasionally you see something and you know it just enough to say, holy crap. This means it's possible to represent speech as intelligible by the addition of 5 additional band limited channels of information. Conceivably, she could understand everything. Now, what was really amazing about it was that lowest frequencies are represented in the normal ear. In the top of the inner ear, his electrode was implanted in the bottom of the inner ear, which normally only represents highest frequencies, the squeaky sounds. And now it was beautifully representing in her the sounds like the low sounding. When she described musical instruments, she'd say, that sounds just like a bassoon. Wow. And I'd say, oh, So I realized that meant that from the point of view of the brain, the coding had incredible flexibility. If you delivered it in the right spatial temporal form, the brain made sense of it. And so I realized at that point that it was probably possible to create a cochlear implant, these devices are called, that could represent speech as intelligible. So I set off to do that. And ultimately, my laboratory did create such a device. Yeah. And one of the 3 commercial devices came from our laboratory, and it was an important invention. So hundreds of thousands of people that are totally deaf.
And do they utilize just the 5 frequency?
They do. They're all implanted in the basal inner ear, or almost, essentially strongly biased to the high frequency squeaky sound part of the inner ear. But and initially, when they're turned on, usually the person, what they describe is, it sounds like someone speaking in a foreign language, or it sounds like someone, a robot language, or maybe say an alien speech. But 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 months later, they hear everything. They have a very high reconstruction in their brain of that results in their recovering an interpretable understanding of language. And it sounds, they say, just like it sounded before they lost their hearing. Now, in relation to that, Mark, here I am, a scientist, a brain scientist, operating in an era in which everyone believes, pretty much in the mainstream of neuroscience, that the brain is only plastic when you're a kid. In fact, only when you're a little kid. And that it basically grows up, it's mature, and now we have a patient. And into this patient, we introduce this device. And we represent information to the brain in a completely different way. And the brain reinterprets and reconstructs it. And now it sounds just like it sounded in this adult, an old adult. Not only that, but across the world, in Australia and in Austria, 2 other research teams dominated by engineers, not neuroscientists. They didn't know about simulation of normal coding. They produced more practical information-based devices. I said, they'll never understand anything. Their results are almost the same. You deliver enough information to the brain, and the brain doesn't care that it's in these different forms. It generates speech as intelligible in every patient population. These 3 major devices out there in the world say it sounds just like it sounded before I lost my hearing. Finally, Mark, those individuals who recover their hearing connect the language received to all of the stored information they have that's language-based. How the hell did they do that? How do they do that? So what I realized, it was awakening that occurred over several years, was that the brain must be massively plastic. All across the span of our lives, we had the ability in a brain to reconstruct language, and in a sense, reorganize and reassociate the meanings of things in a brain that could be even an old brain. So I began doing plasticity experiments. And I began doing experiments in the auditory brain primarily, and then in the somatosensory brain and the information coming from the body surface, again in non-human primates.
Before we move on to
right
and the next, so to get at actually what's going on, the plasticity at the level of neurons and synapses with this cochlear implant. With humans, I mean, you could do functional MRI and get some kind of general idea. It's not very specific in terms of spatial resolution. What about, you know, making an animal deaf and then putting the cochlear implant and then looking at, you know, counting synapses, whatever, in the auditory cortex or whatever? We did do that.
That's one of the classes of experiments that we did.
Yeah.
We actually did the experiment in cats, in cats, in the cat, and it was just cat is you know, I hate, you know, a way we're talking about doing an experiment in an animal. We only did experiments in animals when we were sure that we would generate a useful outcome. I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah.
And when it had medical relevance to us.
Yeah.
When we thought it could really affect in a serious way. I mean, obviously you know, it's a serious thing to take the life of an animal like a cat or a monkey to try to resolve an issue like this. And we took it very seriously. We did not do it casually. I'll just say we did these experiments in cats where the cat could lose its hearing. And in fact, there are cats that are genetically deaf. So they're akin to the cats that, to the humans that are genetically deaf. And actually have been, you know, that's been known for a long time. And we put when we lived in Colorado, we had a Dalmatian that was deaf. There, apparently that breed is you know, prone to deafness. And yeah, absolutely. They bred deafness into the Dalmatians, with high probability. But at any rate, to make a long story short, we didn't really document the plasticity in those models, but we saw how the information was actually represented beyond the inner ear in the brain itself. And we could see that there was no question that it was represented in a completely different form from normal. You know, you could say we could simulate the patterns of activation that were occurring in that model, and you could associate it with the patterns that would occur with the equivalent sound information, equivalent in its complexity to listening to speech, and it was totally different. So, but we did other experiments in which we trained an animal to make use of sound and make distinctions about sound that it could not make initially. Or we trained an animal to make use, and these experiments were largely done in non-human primates. Or we trained an animal to improve the power with which it could use, manipulate, or control information that's received, or interpret information it's receiving with its hand, or receiving on the surfaces of its body. And when we did that, we saw the brain rapidly remodel. And it remodeled in ways that accounted for the improvement of the ability or the behavior. So that led us to understand that every time you acquire an ability or improve in an ability, you're actually accounting for that improvement or acquisition of ability by remodeling the machinery of your brain. Yeah. That's what it's all about. And that occurred. One of the first things I did in my research group is I said, okay, let's see if we can find a non-human primate that's very, very old, near the end of life. So with the cooperation of people from the National Institutes of Health Laboratory in Davis, California, we did an experiment on a monkey that was near the end of life. And it was highly plastic, just like it's plastic in a young animal. So we realized that basically this ability, this modifiability, this plasticity, this capacity to acquire, and of course we know this retrospectively. You know, we know that we can acquire any ability anytime in life. We can, okay, I've never played pickleball, but I'm going to take it up and see if I can, you know, and you can acquire that ability, of course, even when you're in the last years of your life. And so understanding that from cradle to grave, the brain is continually revising itself. And Mark, this leads you to another obvious conclusion, and this is right at the heart of what I was interested in. What this means is that your personhood, all of the skills and abilities, all of the things that define you operationally as a human being are acquired through revising your brain, through remodeling your brain across the span of your life. So in a sense, it accounts for the operational person that you are, which is really what I was trying to understand as a young scientist, as when I went into neuroscience. That was my big issue. Yeah. Of course, I wanted to understand why it was conscious, but I also
it
did what it did, you know.
The take-home message is to, as you get older, keep challenging yourself, you know, intellectually or, you know, physically. You mentioned pickleball, or take up some new skill.
Right.
And yeah, so I actually retired from my position at NIH a couple of years ago, and I've written a couple of books, and I'm doing these podcasts, which I enjoy, and I learn a little bit about and get to meet some of the big shots like you. And,
no, you're a pretty good example of a big shot yourself, pal.
I have a lot of friends at UCSF, or not a lot, but some. Lou Reichart and Stan Prusiner, who I've known for decades, and others. So that's a really enriched neuroscience community out there, and
it's a wonderful place to work. Wonderful place to work. Yeah. Just privilege, such a privilege.
Now, you know, you started to talk about the somatosensory cortex, the part of your brain that receives and processes information from touch and, you know, pain and pressure and other kinds of things. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I was very interested in again in the representation of the surface of the body, and interested in the, you know, one of the really interesting things that about our characteristics are we're embodied. You know, if we identify ourselves, we identify ourselves as coming within the limits of our skin, and we understand how that arises. It arises through associative plasticity. So one of the things that happens in the brain is, and one of the most important experiments that was done in neuroscience, to my mind, I thought it should have been awarded a Nobel Prize, but it went largely unnoticed, were experiments that demonstrated the creation of association in the brain and the processes of associating information. So you can train a non-human primate to associate some set of things, A and B, or A and B and C or D, and then you can look in the brain. And you find that the brain is actively connecting A's to B's and B's to C's and C's to D's. And you can also look at the response to A in the brain, and you can see the response, and then you see the brain move to B in the brain. There's no B, In other words, you see the thought, you see the association moving in thought. And of course, this understanding the basis of the motor that drives the flow of action or the flow of thought is an incredibly important thing. Now, one of the things that happens in the brain is as it's associating, as it's receiving information from the body, or for that matter, as it's every time the body is touched, you could say, it's associating that touch with its source. So billions of times, all of those feelings from the body internally and externally are associated with the source, and the source is you.
Yeah.
Just like every time you see something in the world, you know, and you're associating that seeing with the source of the seeing, you put you behind the eyes. Yeah. It's actually creating the self. And you can actually see it growing in the self from in more recent history. People have studied this, right? And they've studied the regions of the brain where this self-creation is occurring. So you've actually generated the self, and you generate it, then what you see happen on the next level is the self develops agency. You see it beginning to take control. I liken it to creating a captain of your ship by associated self-reference. So now we have a captain that's actually in charge. Now, this is created by plasticity in the brain. This is all emergent in the brain, beginning to emerge in a very young child. Now, we way underestimate the importance of information coming into this machinery from the skin. We've way underestimate the importance of this thing.
Yeah.
Much less this part, you know. This is an incredibly important sensory surface for us.
Yeah, and in the brain, they have a physically a larger space. There's more neurons involved in your hand and face than any other part of the body.
Yeah, and we very heavily associate what information we receive from this to things that we see and the things we hear.
Yeah.
It's just, I mean, this is, and you know, we tend to think of these things in sort of their separate sensory or spatial, but actually it's complexly integrated and specialized. And that's what I was interested in. I was interested in not just the representation in the body. I was also interested in phenomena related to aspects of bizarre change that occurred that were medically important. So one example of that is that we know if you use your hand in a certain way in the job, you can lose control of it. It's called a focal dystonia of the hand. It's very, very hard to get rid of. So it's a problem that's endemic in musicians, professional musicians using their hand in a very high performance way, and people that work on assembly lines over and over again in repetitive motion. And ultimately they lose control of their hand, not rarely, and very hard to get rid of. So you can easily create this in the brain by understanding the rules of plasticity. This is something we haven't talked about, Mark. So I'm doing these experiments sort of on the front lines of watching the brain change as you train an animal. In the background, there's a massive amount of wonderful research, which is documenting the processes that control change. You know, all over the world, hundreds of scientists are studying these very elemental processes of change. And they are defining the rules that apply to changing it operationally in something like the acquisition of ability. So we apply those rules, and guess what? The brain follows them, you know, or put it another way, understanding your rules means that you can change the brain at will.
Yeah.
Now, one of the really interesting things about the rules is that they're bidirectional. I can take any brain,
make it worse,
train it, and make it sluggish and lousy at resolving what they're seeing or hearing or feeling. Or I can take any brain and flip it and improve it in its accuracy and in the reliability with which it sees or hears or understands what it's feeling.
But you haven't written any software and selling any software to do that.
No, no. We stay on the positive side. But one of the ways that's important, Mark, is because, in many instances, again, when you lose control of your hand, it's not disease, it's not abnormal exactly. You're driving the machinery, following the rules into the ditch.
And
So
you can recover that. You can get it out of the ditch.
it's all reversible. It's
Yeah.
designed to be reversible. It's designed. So I struggled for about 2 or 3 years to understand, why is it reversible? Why is it that I can send anything in a negative direction, anything in a positive direction? Then it gradually occurred to me. The brain is controlling change on the basis of outcome. When the outcome is, when the brain can't get the answer right, it relaxes its operational characteristics. It actually degrades its performance in a way. Way to think about it is, if you can't resolve what you're seeing, when you only get a brief look, you look longer.
Yeah.
It adjusts its characteristics so that it basically sends them in a simpler direction, sort of back in the direction when you were a baby again, so you can get the answer right. It has the ability to make us successful, even when things arise in our brain that begin to challenge us.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderfully valuable thing to have, but why it's important is that it actually is part of the progression that accounts for a large proportion of psychiatric illnesses. It's actually the brain going backward.
Yeah.
Ultimately contributing to the progression to dementia, to losing it in an older age, to losing performance abilities and how I can control my actions, how I control my movements in the world. All of those things are in play by the brain self-adjusting its plasticity. And it does a wonderful thing, even though you're going to hell, Mark, sustaining control. You're still operational. You still feed yourself and sort of take care of yourself and make your bed. But that doesn't mean to say the machinery is healthy or in very good shape inside. Does not necessarily.
There's some good evidence with depression that structural changes are reversible when a person recovers from depression. Yeah. Even kind of at a gross level, the overall size of the hippocampus.
Yeah,
it shrinks in someone with major depression, but then if they get treatment and recover, actually gets bigger. And so that's good news, right? That even with certain disorders, now with Alzheimer's disease, it's a little more problematic because nerve cells are dying.
That's true, but before that, in the pre-Alzheimer's condition, mild cognitive impairment, it's called. Actually, we've supported, maybe we're up to close to 20 randomized control trials where the brain's been trained. And every one of those trials shows some, different scientists look at different things, but every one of them shows some aspect of reversibility. Yeah. So, one of the problems is that at this point in the progression of loss function, you have to keep training on some level when you're that far in trouble. But actually, if you were sustaining yourself by engaging your brain, this is an important point. It's very obvious. I was asked about 10 years ago, what was my most important scientific achievement? When one of these things that they ask you, you've probably written a page or two about this yourself, and for students. And I said the most important thing I thought was the demonstration that when you engage the brain in training and you look broadly across how that's associated with the brain's health and functionality, everything changes in a positive direction in a way that supports the change. Everything. So we made lists of things and we got to over 30. And these are things that related to the metabolic status of the brain, to the ability of the brain to control blood flow as a function of what's active, to the ability to sustain the blood-brain barrier, keeping the fluids from blood out of the brain tissues, the immune response in the brain, all of these things that don't really relate directly to the neuroscience side, but relate to the support side of the process. It's just like the body. You exercise the body.
Yeah.
You say, well, what gets better in my physical health that supports my action as I exercise? And the answer is everything that supports it gets better.
Yeah.
You know, it's the same in the brain. That we have no idea, very little idea. What does exercise the brain mean? How would you exercise it? What does it want you to do? And what it wants you to do is it wants you to continue to challenge itself to operate with refinement and control. That's what it wants you to do.
Yeah.
It wants you to sustain operations at speed, because brains that are fast and accurate are necessarily physically advanced. And they necessarily have strong supporting assets that relate to everything they do. That's what it wants you to do. It wants you to go to the gym and work on its accuracy and its speed. And across all, wants you to work in different dimensions, or you don't need to go to the gym. You can do that playing pickleball again and appropriately talking to your pals, but you have to exercise the brain to sustain it. And
we know we have a lot of information on what's happening in the nerve cells when they're exercised, and it's
that's
a lot
right.
of it. Interestingly, a lot of it turns out to be similar to what happens in muscle cells when they're exercised.
Right.
They're actually under stress. They're under there's increased free radical production, increased calcium levels, but these genetic programs are activated by that mild challenge that promote growth, clearance of bad stuff, and plasticity.
So one of the things that we did, experiments that we did, is and these experiments were led by Etienne de Villers-Sedani, who's a professor at McGill University, and in my laboratory as a visiting professor. And the experiments were very simple. We looked in the brain of a rat near the end of life. This is Rattus rattus, a Norwegian rat, the wild rat, kind of rat you'd find in your garage. And so the rat's expected to die within a few months. This is near the end of the lifespan. And originally we looked at 18 aspects of their physicality and functionality, right? And we said, well, how many of these things are different from a rat in the prime of life? So it turned out everything was different. And the second thing we could say was, well, these relate to how accurately the brain is operating, how fast it's operating, how physically intact it is, how functionally intact it is, how strongly is it connected, level to level, things like that. And also things, and ultimately we extended this again to relate to things like the vascularization, the blood supply, nutritive supply, immune response and so forth. But we looked at these 18 things and we asked, well, which one of these 18 things advantaged the old rat? And the answer was none of them. Nothing advantaged the old rat. So then we took the old rats and engaged them in behavioral training. They had to work for their food every day for about an hour. And we trained them for a month. And we looked again. And now we ask, well, which of these things are restored to a more youthful level by exercising? And the answer was everything. And not only was it restored, but it was restored on a level in which it approached the status in the animal at the prime of life, or maybe exceeded it. It's all reversible.
One thing and I wrote kind of a commentary article for PNAS on this a long time ago. And I think the title was something like Laboratory Rodents Are Metabolically Morbid, Why It Matters. And the point was that animals in most laboratory facilities are in small cages.
Right.
They're essentially couch potatoes. They have food available all the time. They're not getting much intellectual stimulation, or in many cases, even social stimulation. And, so probably this old rat, which I guess is probably about 3 years old or so.
Right.
If what about if that animal would have been an enriched environment, not having food available all the time? We know that caloric restriction, intermittent fasting can,
Right.
so the point was that in pretty much all studies published, you're taking a couch potato animal,
Right.
and you're looking at some basic aspect of science, could be neuroscience, anything else, and you're doing translational research where you're drug development or other potential therapies, and you're working on a couch potato.
Right.
And so you may see a big effect in certain things when you apply them to a couch potato, but if you apply them to an animal that's already healthy and functioning well, you may not see quite as much of a.
I like to say, the analogy that I use is that if the rat had been living in the streets of Chicago or New York,
Oh yeah.
he probably wouldn't be so close to death. But two observations that relate to this. So one of the things that happened when we trained the animals was that they became feisty again. They were active again. So my colleague Etienne de Villers-Sedani asked, well, how long will this rat live? He's expected to die in a month or two. How long will this rat live if we do nothing more? And the answer is he lived more than a year longer, and his lifespan has increased by about 40%.
Wow.
By doing nothing more.
Yeah.
Now, we could have done something more. Of course, we could have. And the second experiment is another former fellow, Xiaoming Zhou, who's a professor in East Chinese Normal University in Shanghai, did the experiment in a different way. He took rats in the prime of life, couch potato rats, and he trained them. And he asked, well, now if I look at this rat at the same age as we look at these rats at the end of life, what's the state of their brain? And the answer is a lot closer to a fit brain in the prime of life. In other words, the psychologists have a term for this. The term is cognitive reserve.
Yeah.
They say that the brain that survives is healthy and never rolls into dementia and is going to last a long time has cognitive reserve. You know what cognitive reserve is, Mark?
Yeah, well, I know the person who I think coined the term, Jakob Stern, up at NYU.
Yeah, but he confused the crap out of people by not understanding what the hell it is. You know what it is? Brain health.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's not magic.
No, it's not. Well, no, that's a good point. One of my pet peeves is people keep making up terms that there's no reason to make up some new term to describe something. And then, for example, nanotechnology, right?
Right.
Like, people just throw the word nano around, nano this, nano that. It doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, anyway, the world is full of that. So human degenerate confusion.
So one thing, I had a couple specific questions. You had some papers in PNAS. Well, I don't even know. I guess late 70s or 80s. Anyway, the titles of what auditory processing parallels reading abilities in adults. That's one. Speech comprehension is correlated with temporal response patterns recorded in the auditory cortex, I guess. But of course, there's sound and language and speech are all related, but I guess the point of these studies is audition is like critical to our function.
Oh, yeah. And, it's our big secret, our human secret is that we develop language and not just audition. People can operate in language, you could say with sign language. You don't necessarily have to hear, but it's a tremendously advantage to acquire language. And what it gives us the gift of, it gives us the gift to label things, to identify things in another powerful dimension. And it's one of the reasons why human culture has evolved so far, as we evolved language, and then the language goes to written language. So we have still another way to represent the things of the world and to associate them. And then we have pictorial representations of things of the world that relates to what we call it, that relates to how we describe it in written script. You know, that's one of our big secrets for developing our intelligence, for evolving in culture, in humans. So it turns out that many people, about maybe a quarter of people in the human race, are very poor at evolving sound in accuracy, with high accuracy and high detail. And there are a variety of reasons how things that can degrade your ability to acquire this skill, some genetic and also some environmental. And it really disadvantages the person because they're going to struggle to learn to read, or they're going to struggle to continue to support facile reading at an older age. And it turns out it's all plastic. You can refine your ability to resolve information coming in from sound, you could say in high speed, in accurate detail. And that's a really important thing for a person to do, to sustain. So we've actually trained millions of children that struggle to learn to read because they do not represent the sounds that represent the meaning in words with high accuracy. And you can basically train them in a way that basically now their brain can resolve them. And this was based initially on animal experiments, on demonstrations in animals, that you can drive these changes in the speed and accuracy of the representation of sounds in the brain. So again, this is another example of how you can gain information from a handful of monkeys in studies in non-human primates that can have powerful human impacts, social and human impacts that change lives in individuals in a large scale.
Yeah, I should get I've never had my hearing tested, I don't think, except when my kids, this was just a few years ago, they came to me and they said, look on this computer, you can test your hearing. And these high, you know, so they have this high frequency tone and I couldn't hear it.
Right.
You know, and they could hear it. I go, but I guess that's pretty common as we get older.
The majority of us have high frequency loss, some level of high frequency loss with age. Yeah, that's a very common problem, and ultimately it encroaches on in the frequency range that's important for us to hear distinctions in speech. And then it can be a real problem, and hearing aids can be a real solution for it, or a real source of help for it. And
now, some of your work indicates that that a risk factor for dementia, and I guess other people's work too, is hearing problems.
Well, they are, but so too. I mean, the problems are more general than that commonly. They can arise from, and basically it's a brain not very well taken care of.
Yeah.
And commonly, the listening brain is more susceptible from the point of view of loss. It's more likely that you're going to have problems with loss of hearing that will impact, many operations in the brain.
Sure.
So one of the strongest factors that contributes to risk of progression of dementia is severe hearing loss. So it's something to worry, concern yourself with. It's something to pay attention to in an older, at any age.
Sure, many of the things we do during our daily life, in terms of challenging the brain, come through auditory, language, language in particular.
I'd like to emphasize the brain has an unbelievable ability to compensate for this if you operate fluidly in sign language, which is sort of really exciting and amazing to me, and actually occupies the listening cortex in a deaf individual. If you look in that part of it where it doesn't just sit there idly, not stimulated because there's no information coming from the ears, it's taken over in language by information that's now coming from vision and expressed by your body and hands and face. Isn't that, I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah.
it just takes it over, and actually it actually represents language with the same sort of divisions of the operations in language that are represented if you could hear it. So it's not really so much that I just want to make that one important exception. You do not need to hear. What you need absolutely is operations in language.
So it kind of makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, there's some thinking and evidence that, gestures, hand gestures and so on were like a precursor to spoken written language. And you can imagine whatever, hunter-gatherers and their group out hunting, and you don't want to make a lot of noise, so you make hand gestures, or you have some simple sounds to the signal, whatever,
right,
danger, come here, and
right.
so it kind of makes sense that there's this plasticity between different sensory inputs.
Right.
And actually, I did a podcast with oh geez, I can't remember her name, on the brain, how the brain responds to sensory deprivation, And of course, we know from Hubel and Wiesel's work and others, if you cover one eye, you get these plasticity changes. But the cross-modal plasticity, the evidence for that is a little bit more recent, and but it's very exciting.
Yeah, well, that's the other another interesting aspect of that are wonderful studies that were conducted in which they looked at individuals that are chronically blind, and they saw that the visual brain doesn't just sit there again.
Yeah,
it's occupied by information that would be relevant to you operating in the world and keeping track of where things are in the world. But now they can't come from your eyes. That information has to come largely from the surfaces of your body and from information that's coming from the deeper structures in your body. That's how you sort of figure out where you are, and from listening.
Yeah.
So the brain has this incredible capacity to represent things in completely different places than it normally would, and on the basis of these competitive processes that relate to the assets it's delivered. It's an exaggeration of what happened in a cochlear implant. I'm going to have this completely different way. I'm going to represent something as complex as human language and deliver it to your brain, and the brain doesn't care. It makes sense of it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's amazing.
So you want to briefly, you talked about the brain training, but specifically Brain HQ. I watched I think a couple of your lectures where you have slides showing examples of, how this works, at least in a couple different dimensions.
Right.
You want to kind of just give viewers and listeners a picture of what Brain HQ is?
About 25 years ago, 30 years ago, we began to understand that we could help individuals that are struggling in life by training their brain and helping them overcome weaknesses or deficits or problems they have, issues they have. We've trained millions of individuals, children and adults, that are variously struggling. And in a sense, as we get older, almost all of us on some level are struggling. If our brain is not in good health, you could say, if we're not taking the care of it as we should. And in any event, it's relatively easy to exercise your brain on a computer in a way that advantages it, that increases its strength, that grows its cognitive reserve. And you want that for two reasons. You want to sustain your health. Well, let's go back a minute, Mark. You go to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, how you doing, Mark? And you say, I guess I'm okay. I just had your annual brain exam. So how the hell can it be in 2022 there is no medicine of the brain?
Yeah.
Why is that? And actually, brain health should be managed from cradle to grave. You should not go to the doctor without the doctor being concerned about the health of the organ inside your skull.
Yeah.
And so
that's a really good point. There's no testing. There's some, as you mentioned now, you can do some fairly simple tests with a computer-based things to get an idea how a person's doing.
So what we do at Brain HQ is we have constructed into the exercises that you would perform an evaluation of how your performance relates on that elemental skill or ability to the rest of the human race. You can actually relate yourself and your age. You say, well, how am I doing for other people of my age? But you can also say, well, how am I doing in relation to the average 20-year-old? Because that's really what you want to know, because you want to be closer to that 20-year-old, right? But basically, you can evaluate yourself in a broad range of skills. Those skills relate to the speed of operations of the brain. They relate to your ability to control your attentive resources in operations in the brain, which really strongly relates to how well the brain is supporting its plasticity and mechanistically. You can look at your operations in intelligent operations and thought. You can look at your operations in your navigating your way across the world and over the planet. You can look at your executive powers and function. You can look at all of those things and determine how you're doing, and then you can exercise them. And when you exercise them, you're driving changes in health that are like the changes that we saw in animal models. And there have now been, if you go to the Brain HQ website and just go to the science section, you'll see that there are several hundred reports from random assigned control trials that demonstrate for normal individuals or individuals that are variously struggling with psychiatric illness or with neurological problems or in a whole rich variety of forms, that you almost always see substantial benefits expressed physically, functionally, chemically in the brains of the individual that exercises. So it's a little like say, well, do I expect if I went to the gym and I exercised myself, I would get better? And of course you would expect that. And in general you do. And it's the same with your brain.
And is there so if exercise, say you're an endurance person, you can overdo it, but is there like a minimum amount of time putting on training, or is it all additive? It just keeps adding up and adding up.
Well, what I would recommend the person do, and what I do myself, is I work at taking care of my brain, you could say, 2 criteria that are important to me. I'm interested in 2 things, Mark. I'm interested that I'm operationally sustaining myself. I'm not going backwards. And what I do is I sort of have a benchmark. If I think of myself as in performance, how is my performance the same now as it was 5 years ago, as it was 10 years ago, as it was when I was hypothetically 20? That's what I'm seeking, right? Now, so one thing is a general indication of health. And I know from science that is, if these things I'm measuring or indexing on Brain HQ, I know that they're indicating general health, because again, all of these things change together, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the second thing I'm interested in is longevity. So let me talk a little bit about longevity. We don't necessarily think about the brain and its health as relating to longevity. We tend to think it's our organ, my kidney's going to fail, my heart's going to stop beating, right? But your brain does something incredibly important that relates to longevity. I don't know why it's so hard for people to understand this in the literature or in medicine.
It's the master and commander of your whole body.
Thank you. Exactly right. And so one of the really interesting classes of experiments that have been done in the last several years, especially, is a demonstration that you actually improve that regulation when you exercise the brain using Brain HQ like exercises. So you can look at things like the operations of the autonomic nervous system, which are modulating your immune response and contributing to all of these ongoing, control of all of your organ function, and it's upregulated. It's powerful again. So again, you want to sustain the brain to body control in a sophisticated level, because basically it is a sense putting all of your organs through their paces. So I think one of the things that we're going to see is that when we integrate brain medicine and really take it seriously, really sustaining the brain in its health, I think we're going to see a very substantial uptick in longevity.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Have you had any success in getting physicians to incorporate this into their practice?
Well, to say that it's there are outliers, but this is really still something. I've just written a book about this, Mark, which is meant to be a combination of an informative treatise for physicians and a gentle slap in the face of brain-oriented doctors.
And is this book out, or is it?
No. It's in the hands of a publisher. It's being shopped now for publication. It'll be published in the next while. I have written a book about this subject. That's still not too dated. It's called Softwired.
Oh yeah. I haven't read the book, but I think I did come across it.
It's an introduction to aspects of this science. It was written in 1915 or 2015, so it's a little bit dated.
It's on plasticity.
It's on plasticity,
yeah.
Right? But I've written 2 additional books that are now about to be published. The book I'm talking about is tentatively titled Brain Dead. And I think it's a challenge to medicine, basically, to incorporate the health of the brain into everyday medical practice. And then the second book is called...
And brain dead, meaning that the healthcare system is brain dead.
You got it.
Yeah.
And the other book is called Criminal Injustice. And what it's about is the fact that when you offend on a level in which you must be banished from the rest of us, that's a strong indication that you have a neurological issue that's serious, and you should be helped to overcome it. You should basically banish to correction, true correction, which is neurological correction, and not in this childish, idiotic thing that we now do, which is to take our revenge and punish you and make you worse.
Yeah, it's not good.
Anyway, lots to do.
Yep. Yeah, good. You covered everything. No.
It's such a delight to talk with you about these things, Mark. We haven't talked. I'd love to talk about more about the wonderful research that you've done that relate to these issues of health. And the extensions in neurology. I've become increasingly interested myself in this sort of more complex interplay between organ function and health and general metabolic function and health and brain health. And I've been increasingly interested in making more elaborate, using more elaborate measurement strategies. We have this incredible power now to look at all kinds of things in blood.
Yeah.
Several thousand proteins, several thousand analytes. We can do all of this stuff in the biome. We can do all of this
metabolomics.
Yeah, and then we have an increasing power to look at gene expression and in all kinds of elaborate detail, as well as your genomics, and then everyone could have a much more complete and reconstructed personal record, medical record, and that could richly inform us about the relationship between general health and neurological health. So another thing that really bugs me is that commonly when you're ill, we identify the illness as, diabetes, heart disease, whatever it is. There's a neurological dimension to it.
Yeah.
Guess what isn't treated? What's treated is the most direct, sort of crude, obvious physical problem in the body.
Yeah.
And we need to begin to think about more complete, more holistic, more thoughtfully, generally considered. You know, it's as if the brain is not, or the head is not really connected to the body. It's just crazy.
Yeah, well, and as you know, it's a lot of this has to do with profit-driven healthcare system, and unfortunately, our elected people, Congress, Senate, often, you know,
Yeah.
getting money. And when I was at NIH as a scientist, my wife could not have any stock in any company that's related to healthcare industry.
Yeah.
Okay. And we're like really, and I think it's okay. We're really strictly monitored for this kind of thing.
Right.
We can't be taking any money from well, as a professor at the university, actually you can, but
Yeah.
But anyway, congressmen and senators, there's no such restrictions. And so most of them make a lot more money from these other sources, whether it's stock or whatever,
Right.
than they do from their salary. Yeah, and they're making the decisions.
Yeah. Right.
And so what happens is that, unfortunately, the healthcare system, what you talked about, you wait till somebody gets sick, and then you treat their symptoms.
Yeah.
And how do you? It has to come from the ground up, I think.
Well, the other problem I see is that it comes from the structured basis of medicine itself too. I mean, the doctors of the head don't associate very much with the doctors of the body. They're two different. They're two different.
I've run into this.
Yeah.
I've run into this personally. So I've had these pain issues for decades, and then I had this mountain bike accident 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And had some really bad damage to muscles in my core, my rectus abdominis, my hip adductors. I had 3 surgeries. Then I had a hernia and so I have these pain issues. So I had to figure this thing out myself.
Yeah.
So I had genome-wide exome sequencing on me, right?
Yeah.
And the reason was because my pain seemed to be out of proportion to the actual, what they were telling me about the physical damage. For example, I have tendonitis now in my ankles. And so it turns out I have a mutation in a voltage-dependent sodium channel that's highly expressed in nociceptive neurons.
Yeah.
And then I talked with Steve Waxman at Yale, who's like the world's expert on these. They're actually very rare sodium channel mutations, and you can imagine why they're rare sodium channels.
Sure.
And so anyway, bottom line is I have this hypersensitivity to pain stimuli. So something that a regular person would say, oh, this kind of just a mild thing, and go ahead and keep exercising or whatever. To me, it's like my perception is it.
Yeah.
But I went around to a lot of different people.
Yeah.
Including even psychiatrists and the pain doctors and neurologists. And so ultimately I kind of had to, but other people wouldn't have been able to figure this out, right? They're not a scientist, so they, and
scientists wouldn't have been able to figure it out.
Well, yeah, well, the next step is how do I fix it? And so I've been thinking about using CRISPR.
Oh, well,
gene editing.
That would be totally.
And there the problem is, it's easy to develop the CRISPR construct and target the dorsal root ganglion neurons. That's easy, but I've talked to a couple. I want someone to inject this into my dorsal root ganglion. No, and so I can't, and I've talked to the rare genetic disorders group at NIH, and they say, well, there's a lot of hoops you got to go through to do this. self-experimentation.
Well, medicine is evolving in this kind of direction. We can't have enough information. And I mean, obviously the analytics of it are complicated, but I dream of an era in which that analytics will be there. And you can gather enough information from someone like yourself to basically come up with at least a short list of possibilities and say, well, how could we respond to this? And I have a feeling that and out of this research will come, basis of, or at least the outline of a response, things to try that are bona fide, that are valid. And anyway,
yeah,
I mean, medicine is just so, I don't know. It's so tied up in with people operating in these boxes in this more broadly unenlightened way. And this is especially the problem for people on the head side. What does a psychiatrist really understand about physical body medicine? And what does a renal specialist really understand about the brain? I mean, there's just this division that's completely in the way of thinking about these things holistically, and it's imagined that they're unrelated.
So I mentioned I had a hernia, right?
Yeah.
So I went to the sports medicine doctor who I see, right? And I said, I have a small bulge here. I think I may have a hernia, and could you kind of confirm that? And you know what he said? I can't do that. I need to send you to a general surgeon who deals with patients with a hernia.
Yeah.
And my simplistic thinking was, really? I mean, I thought, being able to evaluate someone, man in particular, for a hernia was like med school, first year.
Pretty elementary.
Pretty elementary, but no. And I guess it has to do with issues of, potential malpractice or something that, like, all these specialists, they're specialized in their areas. And then the GPs, all they do is send you to a specialist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's nobody that knows, like in olden days, right? Medical doctor would know a lot about a lot of different aspects.
Well, I'd like to be real critical about that, and I am, but it's a general problem that plagues our science too. How many people in our science are broadly understanding of operations of the brain? I mean, and how much of what is being done scientifically is basically a kind of regurgitation of things that were historically done. About 85 or 90% of what's being done in the contemporary domain of science is a continually chewing on the things that were resolved historically. And
that's true.
It's in part because there's such a, I argued to the National Institutes of Health for a while that they should create a new specialty in science, and it should be the scientific interpreter of the complex data sets that are flowing into I mean, we need some an interpreter is beyond, I don't mean a speculator, I mean an interpreter. I mean a person that's basically looking analytically at these broad advances and saying, on this basis, what can we say is resolved? On this basis, what would we say needs resolution? And
that's
it's
a good idea.
Such a swamp,
Did they respond to you?
Nah, not really.
Yeah.
No, they never do. I think in some quarters, Mark, I'm known as one of those old cranks that's out there, and still. Anyway.
I don't know. It's important to have people who have a broad knowledge base and think outside the box. And everybody's in their little niche. And you go now, most graduate school and postdocs, the training is you actually don't learn about much except the very specific area of
exactly.
research of your mentor.
And in your era,
Yeah,
not across historic time, but in your era,
yeah,
which is another really big shortcoming, because from that broader understanding comes perspective and comes invention. You
yeah.
know, I try to tell students and people I work with, you know, always remember that when things were less completely understood, the logic was the most complete in a sense, because they understood there were more possibilities. And because there are more possibilities, they had to at least frame those possibilities in their way of thinking about things. You're freezing out most of the things in your domain of possibility because you know too much. When you actually, but you know too much, but actually, you know, relatively little.
That's right.
Because you're dealing with the twigs on the trees. You're not really looking at the damn tree.
You know, and now you mentioned you had a trainee who is back in China now, and
Right.
you know, it used to be, say, in the late 80s and 90s, when I had a postdoc from China, they would never consider going back.
Yeah.
But now they got, you know, I've had multiple postdocs recent years go back. They get really nice,
Yeah.
packed, you know, lab setup and resources, and you know, kind of semi-guaranteed funding. And I'm a little worried we're getting behind now in a lot of areas
Right.
of research. Now, I don't know, I never thought of this issue of, you know, thinking more broadly and not being so specialized. I'm not sure how they're doing it in China,
Right.
but I think they're, in a lot of areas, they're already ahead of us.
Right. Well, this guy is an example of a person that went back for a better support than any fellow in that era that went from my laboratory to an American laboratory.
Yeah,
He got more money and more assured support over the longer term.
yeah.
And you know, he's been there and this was 7 or 8 years ago. So, you know, it's just you're right. We're being challenged by it and not responding very, very well.
Yeah.
Well, it's been wonderful to talk to you about all of these things, Mark, and wonderful to see you again. And you're obviously having fun with this podcast.
Oh yeah, I am. I got to get distribution. I need to send out emails to, I don't know what, neuroscience programs, undergraduate in particular. I think this is kind of ideal for undergraduates who have interest in the brain, neuroscience.
Yeah, I think they'd enjoy it.
Yeah. Okay, Mike.
Okay. Well, it's great to see you again, and hang in there, and good to see you in good health, and good luck with your CRISPR. Let me know how that works out, pal.
Well, actually, I'm most concerned with my son's actually finishing up his PhD at Hopkins in biochemistry, and he hasn't got sequenced yet, but you know, so I have a son and daughter, so we don't know.
Sure.
And my pain issues didn't really start till actually the age of my son now. So, you know, we're kind of thinking about using me as a guinea pig.
Yeah, well, why not?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we old guys are good for.
Okay. Okay, Mike.
Take care. Nice to see you again. Stay in health. Take care.
Likewise. Bye.